Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Tammy Tuckey Show. My name is Tammy Tuckey, and it's good to see you. So I'm excited because I get to announce tonight that I am teaming up with Undercover Tourist for future episodes of my podcast. So are you heading to Walt Disney World or Disneyland or Universal Studios on a budget? Save money and get your park tickets at Undercover Tourist. The link is going to be posted in the chat right now, which will be to your right-hand side. And also it will be in the show notes below. You know, I've purchased my tickets from Undercover Tourist many times over the years. I've always go to directly to them for the discounted prices. And it's always been such a blessing because it's very easy to book through them and then also link your reservation to your My Disney Experience account, which is always a plus because sometimes technology and myself, we just don't work together. So anyways, with that being said, we now get to introduce our guest for this evening. He's a fellow author and also a fellow Pennsylvanian. Let's welcome Spencer Wright to the show. Welcome, Spencer.
Well, hello. Thank you for having me on.
Oh,
Great to be
such
here.
a joy. It's nice to meet you, and because we've seen each other online in the past, and then you reached out because you have your new book, which just came out, which is called The Enchanted Disney Stories of Walt, Hollywood, and the live action film. So let's get a nice, beautiful look at this cover. We've got Walt and Mickey, and there's your name.
Yes.
And this is a big book. This is a hefty book. You got some really great tales in here. So I'm glad you're on the show this evening. So why don't you tell me about the decision to write a book in general, even if it wasn't, you didn't decide yet on what it was going to be about. What just made you say, you know what, I want to write something?
So about 5 years ago, I've had a lifelong love of Disney history, film history, old Hollywood. And when I mention old Hollywood, I'm talking about the period maybe from about the mid-20s to mid-50s when filmmaking was centered in Los Angeles. So one book idea I had was a sort of book where you talk about the connections between Disney and old Hollywood. So one section of the book was going to be talking about people from this world who then later appeared in live action films. And as I got working, I realized, a lot of these stories could easily be a chapter. And if I find a way to, thread them together well, this could easily be a book. So I came up with 15 chapters, so 15 people. And I connect them all together by discussing the history of the Walt Disney Company, Hollywood, film as an art and as a whole. And again, through the lives of 15 people who appeared in Disney live action film.
I think that was my most surprising aspect is opening the book. Usually you look at the table of contents, you're like, okay, what am I in store for? Because there's so many books about Disney and film in general. So when you get one, you're just like, okay, well, what is this going to be like? So when I saw it was a list of individuals who had worked for Walt, I was like, oh, well, this is really interesting. A lot of names that maybe are not very well known. And then there's some names like Agus Moorhead, Ray Bolger, Debbie Reynolds. You have a wide variety of individuals who performed for Walt. So for me, that would be so difficult. Everybody asked me when I released my album, how do you narrow it down to all these songs you want to cover to like a specific amount? So you have to narrow, I'm sure, down all these names that you really want to talk about. So how were you able to narrow it down?
Well, the first thing I did was just make the list. Every name I can think of, put on this list, and then make sure I'm covering different eras of Hollywood, a good variety of Disney films. I talk about quite a few films from the early 60s and the mid 60s when it was really a golden age at the Walt Disney Studio in terms of films. But I also wanted to cover the 70s post-Walt, because there's a narrative that the studio went into a severe decline. And just like anything with history, the story is a little more complicated than that. So it was writing out the people's names and their movies and time periods. So I mentioned a few spots when film as an art was brand new. And then also well after these large studios fell apart. So it was complicated because there were people I would have loved to have talked about that I kind of had to just put aside for now. Doesn't mean I can't write about them going forward.
Of course. Yes. Well, when you have a follow-up, but right now it's a great focus on specific characters. And the one that I really wanted to read first was Agus Moorhead, because I really love her performance of Pollyanna. And I just had interviewed Nancy Olson and Haley Williams. So that movie was like still in my mind and her performance. So I kind of dived into that, and I not to spoil anything, but it was so interesting because you found out that she was a very quiet person on set as opposed to the character that she plays. So where did you find that information from the other cast members?
Well, one of the sources was there's a wonderful biography of her by author Charles Tranberg that's very detailed. It was based off of that. There are several books based on live action studio, but the other thing you do is, read or learn or interview as much as you can about other people on that list. So Jane Wyman, who plays Aunt Polly, was a close friend of Agnes Moorehead. So, was learn as much as I can about Jane Wyman, because not only will I learn more about Agnes Moorehead and the movie Pollyanna, but also the Walt Disney Studio as a whole and how it fit in. So you can really create a consistent picture. One great thing about the Walt Disney Studio is it's very, very consistent in terms of it being clean, professional, friendly. They expected you to work hard to be professional, but still be casual and have a lot of fun. So it's really, and luckily during the pandemic. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, we were skipping in and out. I was just going to say that, recently when you have other film studios and their stories, from most notable names, Mickey Rooney and Shirley Temple, about how some studios weren't collectively as nice. It's nice to know. It's nice to know that the Disney studio is kind of on the polar opposite, because as you found in your book, and as I have found with the people I've spoken to who were there, it was as everybody has said it was, and even more. So it's really interesting when you have that breaking point of Walt passing away, and what does happen to the studio. So what was the most surprising thing that you found through that section of the studios being able to continue on?
One thing I realized is that, Walt and then his brother Roy as well had really built this solid infrastructure. So they had a team of people. And, in terms of the live action films, a lot of the people who worked on, say, Mary Poppins or Pollyanna or Swiss Family Robinson were then working on these films into the 70s. And I mentioned this with Suzanne Plachette in her chapter, how, Walt created this framework and a system of values. So it does, thrive into the 70s. It does start to fall apart as people retire. And there's not always the same financial investment that Walt might have put in movies. But there's still a lot of great work well into the 70s. One of my favorites being Bedknobs and Broomsticks. I mentioned the Shaggy DA in several places. So, sometimes there's this notion, luckily it's changing, that when Walt passed in 1966, sort of like a light switch went off. That's not true at all. There were quite a few bumps in the road, but they also continued to thrive quite a bit as well. They opened Walt Disney World on time and on budget, which is no small feat.
I feel like most movie studios were kind of having like this downfall at the beginning of the 70s anyways. It wasn't just the Disney company. You know what I mean? Because I remember reading about how, the great movie musical kind of, disappeared after Hello Dolly came out in 1969. So there's like this different period of movies coming out, especially when you had the live action ones being the musical kind, right? So I remember, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the last, I guess, big musicals that they did besides Bedknobs and Broomsticks, wasn't it the one and only Genuine Original Family Band? It was I think that was one of them. And then they did Pete's Dragon later in the 70s, but I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, and Pete's Dragon was either 1977 or 78. And then I think by the late 70s, that's when you see the Disney studio struggling, especially as, people sort of want something besides the corny family fare, which Walt admitted he loved. He's like, well, I love corn. This is what I like. This is what people like. But then they started to struggle. So I briefly mentioned, why Touchstone was founded, because even a movie like Splash was seen as too racy.
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I watched that recently. I went, yes. It's not the typical movie you put Disney on, but what a great idea to kind of deviate away a little bit and add more flavor. And I can only imagine. So it sounds like you like the golden age of Hollywood. So you've been to Walt Disney World several times, just like myself. So were you a huge fan of how MGM Studios, aka now Hollywood Studios, were you a huge fan of how MGM Studios used to be?
I can't tell you how much I love the Great Movie Ride. And luckily, because
Oh,
of YouTube, I could watch it many times, different angles, different narration. And I do mention that attraction a little bit in the book. I did have to restrain myself a little bit because I bring it up when it's relevant. I'm like, ultimately, this isn't a book about the Great Movie Ride, so I have to keep it a little more moderated. Also, the backlot tour. Um,
oh,
it was a little painful to learn about all
best.
the ideas they had with the Muppets, and there was basically an idea for they got pretty far in development of like a Muppet themed Great Movie Ride. And I'm like, part of me is
Yes.
almost wishing that I didn't learn this because it's like torture to learn all the stuff they were going to build. But that park, as like a preteen teenager, was huge, especially that Wizard of Oz scene. I absolutely
Oh,
loved that scene.
so good.
Um, but I will say that I hadn't really even thought about that attraction for years until I Googled to watch it. And then watching it, I can kind of see why maybe it was time to move on with some of the stiff
I think yes. I think
animatronics.
yeah. I think if you're gonna if you're gonna go in and just completely gut it, or you could redesign it and
Mhm.
re-release it, I think that would have been great. But I guess I'm sure that the money signs on that were a little bit too much. But
Yeah,
again, that would have been interesting because it's a time capsule of what was popular in 1989, right? And some people were not really a fan of maybe Alien being in it or Footlight Parade. But then you're like, oh, well, they nailed it with Singing in the Rain and Mary
mhm.
Poppins and Wizard of Oz. So I'm curious, what Disney film would you have loved to have seen in the attraction, live or animated?
In terms of a Disney film, I think they built it in several parks, but I think 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is very cool. Another one that's quite
Yes.
lavish is The Happiest Millionaire, and that is one that has quite a fan base. Oh, Pete's Dragon,
Oh,
that's another one. I think I watched that VHS growing up until the VHS just stopped working
for Millionaire,
for Pete's Dragon.
for Pete's Dragon.
Yeah,
Did you have the remember the white casing? It was like that like fancy white liner casing, and then there was like an image of what the movie was, and then Walt Disney's, and then it was the film title on it. Because I remember they had one
yeah,
for The Happiest Millionaire that I would watch all the time, and it had the whole cast sitting outside at the what was it? It was the engagement party scene. It was like a photo I'd never seen before. And I just remember those VHS casings. Remember those?
yeah. They were sort of soft, and you're bringing
Yeah,
back a
I
lot of
just
good memories for me.
I love Happiest Millionaire, and I
Mhm.
love that Mario Cantone. You've heard the Gilbert Gottfried podcast, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I love how Mario always brings up the Happiest Millionaire
Yeah.
because I'm like, I thought I was the only one who knew about it.
Oh, I learned it has quite a following because some people asked me if I was covering it. And it gets a
Oh,
brief
it
mention,
does.
but not in depth. Yeah.
Yeah, I did see it was a brief mention in Agnes's chapter, which was great. Now, question: I did I misread this when I saw that Agnes was invited to opening day at Walt Disney World and she went?
Yeah, she was there, and she was there with her close friend, Cesar Romero, who was later in several
Wow.
Disney films. Yeah, and it's she actually got quite a bit of news coverage. Her and the other celebrities that were there. There's a chapter on Ray Bolger. He was there as well. And I think, and she actually appears in the opening day special because she loved to wear lavender, the same color she wears in Pollyanna. So you can actually
Yeah.
see her like at this orchestral performance. Really, the opening of Disneyland and Walt Disney World, celebrities were a big part of the attraction as well. I think
Well,
what's so funny
you have
about yeah, no, go ahead.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I think what's so interesting about the opening of Walt Disney World, thinking of it now, is that essentially they flew to like an airstrip, like just this random airstrip that was a decommissioned Air Force base, and then took like a bus to the Polynesian, and there was nothing but swampland. And you can see it in the special. It's Cinderella Castle and swampland.
I love that. It's been a while since I've seen that special, but I remember seeing
Mhm.
Glenn Campbell singing Today Is Mine," and he's just like walking around different
Yes.
parts of the swampland, and it's great. I had no idea she was there, and it's funny you mentioned Debbie because I had interviewed her years ago when I was like 17, and she was one of Walt's personal opening day guests at Disneyland. So you cover a little bit about that too, right? So what was
Yeah.
what was one of those special moments of just covering her in particular, because I think a lot of people have such, love for Debbie,
Well, probably a lot of people watching remember her as Aggie in the Halloween Town movies. And I knew she was at the opening of Disneyland, but it seems like that was probably one of the most formative experiences of her life, because Walt, he was very transparent in his lifetime, and he said, "I put everything on the line to open this park. House, life insurance policy. If this fails, I'm pretty much done." And so, through hearing that, she remembered that and the pride he had when she tried to preserve as much as she could of Hollywood memorabilia. As these big
Yes.
studios were being bought up and carved up, in particular Fox and MGM. A lot of the memorabilia they had saved for decades: scripts, costumes, photos, props, everything. A lot of it was just getting thrown away.
Yeah.
So she made every effort she could to preserve it. And it was something that in a lot of ways consumed her whole life. So initially researching that, I felt it was extremely sad, and it is sad in a lot of ways that she tried so hard and had so many failures in trying to open a museum and save this. But at the same time, she strove and never gave up to save as much memorabilia as she could. So I think while there is some sadness in the story that I cover of her trying to preserve Hollywood memorabilia, also keep in mind, she was working off debt she accrued into the 2000s, to try and preserve
Absolutely.
things going back into the 1920s.
Well, we
I mean,
were
and that's
there.
the
My
sort of
parents.
determination.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say my parents had brought me. I was like a baby. I was like 1 years old, and we went to her last museum that she had open before they closed it down. I think maybe 6, 9 months later. I don't remember it, but my parents said that they really enjoyed it and that I really enjoyed it. And seeing everything being auctioned off maybe a couple years ago, and her being on the Oprah Winfrey show and talking about all those pieces. But wow, like what just an amazing thing that she did, because everything was, as she said, scattered to the wind. If you see any of that footage on YouTube of those auctions, it's absolutely heartbreaking. I can't even imagine what
Yeah.
disappeared and what we'll never see again, what was offered. But I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because I didn't even think of it in that perspective, that she went all in, just like Walt went all in. And I
Yeah.
never thought of it that way.
And she constantly for decades said this is just like Walt with Disneyland, not giving up. And a lot of things we have, like the ruby slippers from the Wizard of Oz, they were in a shoebox in a dumpster.
Yeah.
And now they're one of the Smithsonian's
There's a
most
whole story
popular
to those
items.
things.
Yeah.
I know. Like that has its own, those slippers have their own podcast now.
Yeah, I was going to say that. And because watching the Halloween Town films, you would never think that Aunt Aggie has this whole background going back, into the 50s.
She really took pride in it. I have to suggest, I don't know if you've seen it. There's a wonderful documentary that Carrie Fisher, her daughter, was having made. And they finished it, and then they were about to release it January of 2018, but Carrie and Debbie passed in 2017 in December. So HBO released this documentary about Carrie's and Debbie's relationship, but it also features the final auction. And there's this very sad moment in it. I don't want to spoil it, but there's this very sad moment about Debbie reflecting on the things that she does have and not wanting to give them up. And I can't even imagine, because when you're the last of your golden age kind to be alive, and you see, it's just really, really sad. But I'm so glad you featured her in this. And especially, I love Ray Bolger, and I think, I believe, did I misread that you mentioned Babes in Toyland? Because I remember when I first saw it, I was like, that's the Scarecrow.
Yeah.
So what was it like to kind of delve into more of his backstory? Because everybody knows him as the Scarecrow, and not maybe from the Harvey Girls or other films he's done and Babes in Toyland, but what was it like to kind of delve in and learn a little bit more about him?
Yeah, so Ray Bolger, the Scarecrow in the Wizard of Oz, and then Barnaby and Babes in Toyland. He was a lot of fun. Like you said, that's really the role he's most known for, is as the Scarecrow, which he took a great deal of pride in. They really struggled in the making of that film with the makeup and the technology. It's not really even makeup. It was more of like a torture device that he had to wear. And he took great pride in it. He appreciated that, audiences love that role. And he had something that was, that would give him immortality. All these shows that he was in on stage, so many of them kind of are done and then they disappear. I have a chapter on Betty Davis, who didn't mind transitioning from the stage to film, which some people did, because she said all these wonderful plays happen every year and then they're done, but movies are there forever. So he had something to grant him immortality. And it was a story with great values, about heart and home and courage. One thing fun with that too is exploring a lot of the connections between The Wizard of Oz and the world of Disney, which are quite extensive. So that was a lot of fun as well. And then I'll save it for I won't give any spoilers, but also his thoughts on Return to Oz, which I thought was very interesting. Yes, very diplomatic.
I was surprised that you found that. Like, there are things in this book. Again, it's called The Enchanted Disney: Stories of Walt, Hollywood, and Live Action Film. So let's take a look at the cover again, which you can get your copy online now. I actually put the link back in the chat room, and also it's in the show notes below, so you can grab your copy of it. But there's so many great stories that you probably have not heard of before that Spencer has gathered together, it's just great to read. I this is so up my alley, because I remember being a kid and my dad and my mom had so many books and things lying around about the behind the scenes. And I feel like, again, with the loss of, we're going to be talking about this for decades, but the loss of physical media is just, it's just strange, because nobody knows the hard work that goes into these projects and the trials and tribulations that so many people have while they're in their careers. So what about the editing process for you in making this book? This is your first book, correct?
Correct. So the editing process.
Tell me about the editing process for yourself.
So I know the main thing with myself is, so about 2/3 of the book is directly related to Disney, and about 1/3 of the book is related to Hollywood films, the person, etc. And a big part of the editing process was making sure I was staying on point and staying focused. So again, like I mentioned, the Great Movie Ride quite a bit, and there's a lot more history I could have included, but there's a point where, are you starting to drift a little bit here and getting off topic?
Yes.
I wanted to keep things real tight. I talk about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and in parks all around the world that has been included, which I think is worth mentioning. But again, keep it, on point. And then, one of my favorite movies and attractions is, Swiss Family Robinson, the Swiss Family Treehouse. So I talk about the opening of the attraction. Yeah, that's one of my, I hope it never I'll be chained to it if they want to shut it down. But, that's one of those things where there was a lot more detail about the opening of the attraction and the Imagineering behind it I wanted to include, but it's not really relevant to this book. So, I saved it all for future use, so it won't go to waste.
Please, because I want to read about it.
Yeah, I was like, all right, I'll save, because when I initially did, I almost just pressed delete on something. I'm like, no, save it. You never know when you're going to dig it up later. So it was using discretion in that regard.
So from start to finish, started the research to finished editing, submitted, how much time did it take to write the book?
It was about a 5-year process. Now, a lot of it was just learning as much about Disney as I could, so really reading every Disney book I could get my hands on. I liked reading a lot. They're on archive.org. All the film fans, magazines, industry publications are available, because one of the things I like to include is, how does Disney fit into this landscape of Hollywood? They have a lot of differences, but they have a lot of similarities, and it's a constant back and forth. I spent a lot of time studying the early 1920s when Walt arrived in Hollywood. What was that era like? What was the era?
Can you imagine?
Film? Yeah, it was so beautiful.
Being able to walk into that era.
You can walk down and pick an orange off the tree.
Yes. Oh,
yeah.
It would have been amazing. Well, we do have some questions in the chat for you. So first we have Lauren. Lauren's a longtime watcher and listener of my podcast. She says, will your books be available in audio for Disney lovers who are blind?
That I don't know, but I will follow up with the publisher. So I want it to be available for as many people as possible.
If you need somebody to read it.
Yeah. No,
I volunteer as tribute. How about Ashley? Ashley says, hi, Spencer. Which of your actors that you discuss had the most advantages in the film and stage industry? Oh, this is a good question. And who had the most disadvantages?
So one person I discuss is Iris Adrian, and I think in terms of having advantages in the stage and film industry, the one thing that she did is she always just worked the hardest she could. So never got airs about her, was never too particular about finding a job, and so she was always able to find work and be herself. And I think just by being herself, and staying sort of humble, she was really able to thrive in the industry from, we started in show business in the late 20s, pretty much till the early 80s. And she was aware of her place. A lot of this book takes place during a much more shallow time. So, as a woman, she knew, I'm not going to be in my 20s forever, and eventually I'm going to age out. Fortunately, things have changed, but she was aware of this. So she took a lot of her income and invested in real estate. So she always had rental income. Now, in terms of disadvantages, I talk about a few people who had careers in silent film. And the silent era is really fascinating because I don't think it's always discussed all that much. And,
No.
a lot of these actors were basically gods as far as society was concerned. I mean, there were celebrities pre-silent film, but not in this way. Not that anyone anywhere could see for a nickel or a dime. So, my first chapter is on Pola Negri. And one disadvantage she had when she was in silent film and it transitioned to sound that a lot of people had was that she had a very strong accent in an era when there was a low tolerance for most accents. So there were a lot of stars. Another one is named Vilma Banky. She doesn't have a Disney connection, but there were a whole list of who were just absolute gods in society who essentially had no career. Yeah. Probably one of the most famous who had this problem was also an actress named Clara Bow, who's notorious for having actually Singing in the Rain with Debbie Reynolds talks about this issue of, this transition to sound and how does your voice sound? What kind of accent do you have? So I think a lot of people from that era really struggled.
And a lot of films are lost to time because fires. My dad will attest to this. The film was on nitrate, correct? I think I'm getting some of my history right here, I hope. But some of the films are lost to time, and sometimes they're able to find it and preserve it. So again, I would love to see another documentary on that specifically. I did a research. I remember in high school, I did research on Gloria Swanson, and I had no idea of the backstory of the silent era of film. And that was such an eye opener because that was the way film was done. There was no sound, and silly me, I'd been watching Singing in the Rain for years, and I did not make the connection until finally I was like, oh, okay, this is what it was. So it's just really fascinating. 68 Freight Train says, what actress was the hardest to research, and what made that research difficult?
Well, initially, I'll go back to Iris Adrian. I thought she was going to be quite difficult because she was a character actress. So a lot of films from this era, the 30s, 40s, 50s, had people who might be in dozens or hundreds of movies and have like a line or two. And they had, the same kind of role they always played. So in her case, she played, this is in quotes, tough broads who are never mean, or tough old gals with hearts of gold. So I figured, I don't know how much is going to be on her. And she didn't have children. There's no family to talk to. But it turns out that she wasn't all that difficult because she was so funny that people loved interviewing her. And because she had a secure retirement, she always loved to be interviewed. So that was one that I started. And I thought, all right, I'll see how this goes. But luckily, I have plenty of backups. And it turns out that, actually she was one of the biggest pleasures that I had to research.
That's really nice. I like that.
Yeah, it was a nice surprise. And she's actually where I got the title of the book from. She referred to Disney as the Enchanted Disney.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. See, that's even that even seals the deal even more for me with like just the book in general. And my dad followed up. He says nitrate produces a gorgeous black and white or color image, but it's extremely hazardous. So when it burns, it burns. So he said nitrate was up until World War II and a little later, and only 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter, and 8 millimeter was always the safety film. So if you find any of nitrate film, be very careful. So why don't we close out?
Yeah, the way one person explained it to me is they printed the film.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, one scholar explained to me they basically printed the films on bombs. That's how you should think of it, because that's how delicate nitrate is.
Yes, but it's gorgeous.
It
My
is.
dad says, if anything, put nitrate in a metal can. He is correct.
Mhm.
So why don't we end? I have two questions for you. What's your favorite comfort Disney animated film?
The Aristocats. Anything with cats, I'm in, but the animation in that film is just gorgeous.
Oh, I love the colors. The colors, it's so
Yeah.
good. And I just love it when the mouse like wants to eat his cracker. Great moment in the film. And then what's your favorite comfort Disney live action
And the
film
music in
and
that
why?
film is great. Oh, Swiss Family Robinson, especially if, if you both live in Pennsylvania, especially like January, February, on a day when it's like 10 degrees outside. The idea of basically living outside with all those animals is just fantastic.
Yes. I wouldn't mind giving it a
Yeah.
shot. Like if they had something on the Disney private island which had its own treehouse. I think they do something like this. I don't know where, but I think that that's a cool idea. I always wanted to know what would happen if they offered that opportunity. Like I think they offered to sleep in the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland, and I was like, what if they offered the opportunity to sleep in Swiss Family? I would love that.
I would. I want to sleep in like one of those huts on the safari with all the animals around.
Yeah, that would be well. See, for me, I'm
Yeah.
scared of anything creepy crawly. So put me up in the highest tower you got.
Right.
Lauren says, I love Aristocats too. Spencer, I would love for you to invite you to be on her podcast. That would be great. You could talk more about your book. I'll connect you guys, Lauren. Lauren is so sweet. She's
Okay. Yeah,
followed
please.
all these years. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. We're like a little delayed.
Yeah, it's okay.
But it's so great to have you on the show tonight, Spencer. Again, make sure you get your copy of Enchanted Disney. The link is in the show notes below and also in the chat section to your, I think your right-hand side, this way, right next to Spencer. Spencer, so nice to chat with you. Hopefully we're going to meet in person because Pennsylvania is our home. So we can finally meet and I can have you sign my copy.
Oh, I'd be happy to.
I'd be honored.
Absolutely.
And also, just as a friendly reminder, thanks to everybody who joins this evening. If you'd like to see more interviews and reunions, there's plenty more in store and plenty more you might have missed since we talked about the great movie ride tonight, Spencer. I think I kind of started the new version of this show with a live interview with some of the Imagineers, and that was so much fun. I would definitely take a look at that if you haven't. Subscribe to my channel. Share this conversation with your friends on social media. Spencer's on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. You can find him and message him if you have any questions and have already gotten your copy. You can feel free to follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Tammy Tuckey, Facebook at singer Tammy Tuckey, and you can find out more on my website, tammytuckey.com, including a place to purchase your copy of my new album, Glowing in Timeless Places. So thank you so much, Spencer. This has been so much fun.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
It's been such a treat. See you soon, everybody. And remember, everybody wants to be a cat, but a cat's the only cat that knows where it's at. Right, Spencer?
Absolutely.
Have a good evening, you guys. Thank you, Spencer.
Thank you.